This is the 9th annual lecture of the Kimberley Foundation Australia. In the past 8 years, each lecture has been delivered by a learned man or woman with the purpose of acquainting you with the methods and results of research being undertaken in the Kimberley with Kimberley Foundation support. You have heard Professors Mike Morwood, Jim Ross, Karl-Heinz Weyrauch, June Ross, Peter Veth, Jane Baum, Kim Ackerman, and last year Andy Gledo. This year is the 20th year since the Kimberley Foundation Australia was established. It is also 10 years since Graham Walsh died. There are some things that can be said at the time of these two milestones. There'll be no scientific dissertation tonight. Instead, you're going to hear a story with many threads involving many people, all coming somewhat marvellously and improbably together. Common to all has been a commitment to understanding Indigenous culture and history for the benefit of all Australians. This talk has the purpose of setting down on the record the history of the Kimberley Foundation Australia, as well as a setting straight of the record as regards the contribution of Graham Walsh. It would include mention of the constituent elements of the Kimberley Foundation, the board, the scientists, the donors and the Kimberley's Indigenous people, and from the perspective of 20 years, a look at the future of the Kimberley Foundation. Now, the story begins in 1995 with Susan Bradley and 4 Narranyun men. But just a moment. The story doesn't begin in 1995. The story actually begins some 50 or 60,000 years ago. It begins with irregular infill art. It begins with Bradshaw Guion art. It begins with clothes peg figure art. It begins with Wandjina art. It begins with a large body of art that is enormously varied in content and style, spread over thousands of square kilometres in thousands of galleries, much of it extraordinarily well preserved and the almost complete ignorance of it in Australia and the world. But after that, the story begins in 1995 with Susan Bradley and 4 Narranyun men. Paddy Wama, Paddy Nerawara, David Maljali and Laurie Gowanali, who met in Derby at a meeting convened by Hannah Rachel Bell. Out of that meeting came the organisation known as the Bush University, where non-Aboriginal participants were taken out on country by the 4 men already mentioned and joined by 4 women, and for a week experienced traditional culture out in the bush. The participants over the 3 years of the Bush University were mainly from Sydney. Following a drop in commitment from the Aboriginal teachers, compounded by the death of David Maljali in 1997, the Bush University folded. By then, it had recruited and inspired a group who were committed to the protection and preservation of traditional Aboriginal culture, which included Christina Kennedy and Henrik Nicholas. They formed themselves with Susan Bradley, first into a group called Friends of the Narranyun, and then with the help of those same senior men, they became the Wandjina Foundation. That was 1997. In 1998, the first formal meeting of the Wandjina Foundation took place harbourside in Sydney. Henrik Nicholas became the chairman, and a constitution was adopted with the general object being to encourage and support the Kimberley region of Western Australia and its peoples for the purpose of increasing knowledge of the region, its history and prehistory. The Bush University was over and the Wandjina Foundation was in its place with a board committed to preserving and fostering Kimberley Indigenous culture. How to fulfil its objective? In 1999, Susan Bradley met Graham Walsh by chance. Out of that meeting came a trip to the Kimberley, guided by Graham Walsh, which included Wandjina Foundation board members. Committed to understanding and preserving the traditional culture of the Kimberley already, they were set on fire by what they were shown. The questions and conclusions suggested by Graham left them wanting to see research undertaken in the Kimberley. Meantime, while these events were unfolding in the Kimberley and in Sydney, two more threads to the story had been taking shape in the Carnarvons in central Queensland and in Melbourne. In Queensland lived the same Graham Walsh, an unpredictable man of great determination and remarkable ability, who had been documenting Kimberley rock art since 1977. Graham had formulated a number of theories based on his observations about the rock art, the people and the past environments of the Kimberley. He wanted to see his theories tested. The Melbourne thread's my story. I'd found myself by an indirect route in the Kimberley in 1995 with my family looking at rock art with Graham Walsh. I had become fascinated by what the Kimberley had to offer to the telling of Australia's story. I'd been researching Indigenous culture but focused on Western Victoria, so being introduced to the richness and depth of Kimberley Aboriginal culture and its relatively intact state was revelatory. We returned as a family to the Kimberley every year for the next 6 years, and then in 2001 we bought Doongan and Theda pastoral leases in the North Kimberley. We were committed to preserving and understanding Kimberley rock art. Many of you here have visited Doongan and Theda, and both those stations are liberally scattered with rock art of every form. Many of you here might remember from your visits much of this art. These are tassel Bradshaws from the earliest drawings of the Bradshaw period. This is a Bradshaw bird that we call the griffin. These are Wandjina animals from the Aboriginal period of art, and we have here a thylacine from the Elegant Action period of art. There is a lot of art on Doongan and Theda. 2002 saw these various threads and strands come together. Susan Bradley, Sydney-based Wandjina Foundation, Graham Walsh and myself. Susan and David Bradley were managing Doongan Station. Doongan and Theda stations had become a focal point for climate scientists from Griffith University and tsunami experts from the University of Queensland conducting research with Graham Walsh into past climates. The Wandjina Foundation was funding this research into past climates, and I had become a member of the Wandjina Foundation board. Soon after this, the Wandjina Foundation changed its name to Kimberley Foundation Australia and adopted a further object which referred particularly to research into the rock art. Now, the period that followed for the Kimberley Foundation was both frustrating and formative. There was a lamentable lack of Indigenous engagement, a volatile relationship with our principal researcher, Graham Walsh, and I've got here Graham frequently threw a tantrum and resigned and said he'd have nothing to do with this. And I've given you two examples of resignation letters that came to us in this period. So we had a volatile relationship with Graham. We had unreliable funding, we had an inadequate organisational structure, and significantly, a lack of a clearly articulated vision. We understood that the Kimberley rock art held a story seminal to Australians' understanding of their own history and their own country. We had a sense of urgency about getting Australian universities involved in the work. During these years, the Kimberley Foundation found a friend in the eminent geologist Ewan Tyler, who's here tonight, which is nice. Ewan Tyler knew the Kimberley well and wanted to help. He prepared a proposal for a Kimberley Rock Art Research Centre and took it to a number of Australian universities. Over 3 years, he made 30 visits to various Australian universities, museums, departments of environment and premiers, state premiers. To each he promoted the need for a centre for Kimberley rock art research. The response was universally unenthusiastic. Australia was not ready for Kimberley rock art research. 2006 and 2007 saw an effectual Kimberley Foundation begin to take shape. We started with 2 new board members, Laurie Brereton in Sydney and Brenda Shanahan here. Then we sought advice, the most fruitful being from Charles Good and Michael Chaney. Charles, well known to many of you here, also here tonight, and Michael Chaney from Western Australia. As a result, we began to address our organisational weaknesses. We employed a CEO and an assistant. Recommended by Michael Chaney, Mike Lyle-Williams became our first CEO and began to set the proper structures in place. He could see we needed serious academic and scientific input. We also needed clearly worded research objectives and credibility on the national stage, which would partly be achieved by demonstrated research outcomes. He had a clear strategy. First, to put in place a Science Advisory Council for the board. The Science Advisory Council is an advisory subcommittee of the Kimberley Foundation Board made up of a diverse group of established scientists with expertise in a range of relevant fields. It advises the board on all things scientific. Mike tapped Australia's best on the shoulder and invited them to join. No one turned him down. Jim Ross, a highly respected businessman, academic and scientist with positions at the University of Western Australia and Curtin University, accepted the role of chairman of the Science Advisory Council. Under Jim, the SAC became the powerhouse of the Kimberley Foundation, one of the 4 elements that's made for our success. The first job of the SAC was to assist the board in developing a clearly stated vision and associated priority research themes. This, in essence, is what we arrived at. Our vision is to promote scientific research into the rock art of the Kimberley and, in conjunction with the Indigenous people of the region, ensure it is preserved and recognised for its national and international significance. Our slogan became Research, Preserve and Promote, and our principal research areas were defined as past climate and past environments, the characteristics of Kimberley rock art, the age of Kimberley rock art, and the chronology of human occupation in the Kimberley. Then we turned to our funding requirements. An application to the Ian Potter Foundation in 2005 had been rejected, with conditions to be met before another application would be considered. A new application, with input from the Science Advisory Council as to the research aspects and a satisfactory report card on the other requirements, was successful. It was reported at the time that one of the Potter's eminent governors, historian Geoffrey Blaney, said that the Kimberley research is the most important historical research being undertaken in Australia today. It was 2007. This grant was the means of the Kimberley Foundation beginning to seriously support scholarly research. It was hugely significant. It made it possible for us to begin to change what people knew of the Kimberley. New Look Kimberley Foundation was established. Our panel of expert advisors, the Science Advisory Council, advising the board on all things scientific, recognition and an enabling grant from an eminent funding body, a sound administrative and governance structure, and a number of research projects supported by the foundation underway. Significantly, our first Australian Research Council supported a project. Kimberley Foundation's achievements began to be substantial, but before turning to them, I want to deal with all the elements that have contributed to the emergence of this successful organisation. The Science Advisory Council is one, the board is another, the people who have supported us financially, our donors, are another, and the Aboriginal people who have joined us and without whose engagement the research would not proceed are another. With the Science Advisory Council, one competent and committed leader was followed by another equally credentialed. When Jim Ross stepped down in 2013, he was replaced by Andy Gledo from the University of Melbourne. Andy has helped bring the Kimberley Foundation to the next stage of its development. He's been ably assisted by the members of the Science Advisory Council. The board then, the second of these constituent elements, continued to show its calibre as the Kimberley Foundation took up its new responsibilities. I've been on a few not-for-profit boards. This one is remarkable for the contributions the board members make and their commitment and enthusiasm for the cause. A few board members have featured more prominently than others in the story of the Kimberley Foundation that I've told thus far, but it would have been easy to extend the story with more details and bring in every one of them. Retired board members and you got a glimpse of one tonight, continue their involvement as emeritus board members, adding their wisdom at our annual strategy day and generally staying involved. John Calvert-Jones, who introduced me tonight, is one such. Now, our donors. Our donors are our lifeblood. They believe in the importance of our work in funding research into all facets of early human habitation of the Kimberley. And we believe they see us honestly and competently doing that. Without them, we're powerless. KFA donors are the third essential component. We've received hugely significant and enabling gifts from the Ian Potter Foundation, from Andrew and Nicola Forrest, and from their foundation, Minderoo. I have described the gift from the Ian Potter Foundation, which in effect established the Kimberley Foundation. In addition, the Ian Potter Foundation enabled the chair in Kimberley Rock Art Research at the University of Western Australia to be established, and is also supporting the ongoing rock art dating work. Andrew and Nicola Forrest endowed the Kimberley Foundation with a generous parcel of Fortescue shares, and their private foundation, Minderoo, has helped fund the establishment of a second chair, this time in archaeological science at the University of Melbourne. Impex, the Japanese mining giant, with their timely and targeted gift, turned the chair at the University of Western Australia into one in perpetuity. But as well, individual donors, large and small, and I see some of the larger ones here tonight, have give to us for various reasons, many in this room tonight. And why do they give? Some because they see the potential of this research work in the Kimberley to enhance employment opportunities for Kimberley Indigenous people. Others see the importance in uncovering Australia's early history. Others see the global implications of this research for understanding the earliest movement of peoples around the globe, and there are many who want to see Kimberley rock art protected and conserved. They give to the Kimberley Foundation generously, and they trust the Kimberley Foundation to expend those funds for these ends. We hold that trust seriously and do not forget on what terms we are entrusted with these donations. I now turn to the Indigenous component, without whose involvement there would be no research. Because this is an organisation dealing with Indigenous culture, and because our relationship with Indigenous organisations in the Kimberley has not always been as it is today, it's important to highlight the history of the Kimberley Foundation's relationship with Kimberley Indigenous people. You've heard already about our origin in the Bush University, prompted by the 4 Narranyun men. Acute awareness that it was an organisation concerned with Indigenous culture, but with no Indigenous board members, led to the recruitment of 2 senior Queenie people, Dolores Jane Morra and Laurie Weiner, in 2005. Despite their involvement, there was a dearth of Aboriginal leadership on Kimberley Foundation's board. There was also, to speak frankly, a strong sense of antagonism directed towards the Kimberley Foundation from some, not all, Kimberley Aboriginal groups. And this was for 3 reasons. Kimberley Foundation's association with Graham Walsh, who was regarded as racist and a threat to native title. Our closeness to pastoral leaseholders, who were seen as racist and the enemy of local Indigenous people. And thirdly, a reaction to a predominantly white and East Coast organisation making assertions about the Kimberley rock art and its significance. In August 2008, as a measure of how bad the situation was, a delegation from the Kimberley Foundation was invited to present at a Kimberley Land Council meeting. The meeting was highly confrontational. The extent of the lack of trust was clear. Something had to be done, and the board set about building trust and engagement. From there on, every Kimberley Land Council annual meeting, every Kimberley Ranger Forum, every Kimberley Aboriginal Law and Culture meeting, and many meetings of various individual communities where KFA was invited, KFA attended. Laurie Brereton took up on the cause of building our relationships with Kimberley Indigenous organisations, and he became our regular attendee, frequently accompanied by me or Sam Lovell, there on the right. We were given opportunities to listen to grievances and to explain the Kimberley Foundation. Many conversations took place, and the position today is one of accord, friendship and mutual respect with the principal Indigenous bodies in the Kimberley and individuals within those groups. This development is also attributable to another man. In 2009, when matters did not stand as they do today, a vigorous 75-year-old Aboriginal man joined the board. He understood the importance and became a valiant advocate of scientific and archaeological research in the Kimberley. He took his place beside Kimberley Foundation board members in meetings with Kimberley Indigenous people, the tone of which discomforted him. But he didn't flinch from asserting that Aboriginal people needed to know how old Kimberley rock art is and needed to understand the science around the ancient times. His name is Sam Lovell. The KFA's development owes much to Sam. Every member of the board, it is not too strong to say, cherishes him for his knowledge, his common sense and his warm friendship. Solid progress was made on building trust and good relations, culminating in 2014 with the appointment of the Kimberley Foundation board of the Kimberley Land Council's CEO, Nolan Hunter. His guidance and commitment have cemented Kimberley Foundation's credentials, and the addition last year of a senior Willingham woman to the KFA board, Rona Charles, has further built genuine acceptance of Kimberley Foundation's role. And it remains just to remind you that all research in the Kimberley is under collaborative agreements with Aboriginal communities. Strong and true relationships continue to develop. I can now return to achievements. Now, first of all, our first thing is a lot more people, especially in Australia, now know about the Kimberley's archaeological treasures and their significance. But as well, there's been a cultural shift in Australian archaeological circles that has seen Australian rock art recognised for its importance. Starting maybe 8-9 years ago, the rustle of change could be heard around Australia's universities. At ANU, at Griffiths, at Wollongong, at New England, at Monash, and most significantly at the University of Western Australia, departments, centres and research projects focused on Indigenous cultural history, but particularly on rock art, began to emerge. We think we've played a significant role in the growing national awareness. We've had great success also in initiating and supporting large research projects. 5 Australian Research Council linkage grants with Kimberley Foundation as the enabling partner have undertaken work in the Kimberley. Where no PhD students were working, there have now been 10. We've engaged 5 Aboriginal communities with us in work on their country, and 33 young Aboriginal people have done our rock art recording course on country. Our annual workshop on research in the Kimberley has become a significant opportunity for scientists on Kimberley projects and others to exchange and plan future research. The establishment of the 2 chairs, Kimberley Foundation Ian Potter Chair in Kimberley Rock Art at the University of Western Australia, and the Kimberley Foundation Minderoo Chair in Archaeological Science at the University of Melbourne, has created a lasting legacy for Australia. Both chairs are in perpetuity. The Kimberley work will go on. Significantly, each has also been generously supported by the university in which it is found. What do we know now that we didn't know, though? Well, the first thing we've all learned is that one research project does not a definitive answer give. Whether one is recording recreating past environments, or dating rock art, or building a picture of how people lived in earlier times, the picture is only incrementally and project by project built up. On a concrete level, we know that individual rock art shelters are capable of surviving for up to 100,000 years. It was an important thing to establish that the sandstone actually will survive 100,000 years. We know that hitherto undatable rock art of the Kimberley can now be dated. The University of Melbourne team, with their colleagues at Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, ANSTO, are successfully using 4 dating methods from which they are gaining maximum and minimum ages on rock art. So you can't actually date the pigment or the paint, you can date what's underneath it and you can date what's on top of it, and you get sandwich dates. Dates of between 10 and 20,000 have been firmly established on older painting style. There is much more work to be done using these 4 techniques. It is just a beginning. Aboriginal occupation of the Kimberley is 50,000 years, we now know. It's 50,000 years before present, we know that categorically. We have further provisional dates dating back to 65,000 years. Sophisticated tool production and ochre crayons from between 40 and 46,000 years have been found. Plant depictions in Kimberley rock art have been recognised as the most numerous and earliest of any in the world. The work on past climates of the Kimberley is little by little, project by project, yielding a deep time picture. And as I said, with the 2 chairs, the means of continuing the work is in place. Now, you've heard the setting down of the record of the Kimberley Foundation. Now I'm going to turn to setting the record straight in relation to Graham Walsh. There's a short film on Graham.
Over the last 25 years, self-taught researcher, photographer and writer Graham Walsh has recorded more of these exquisite rock art sites than anyone else alive. Graham Walsh is a rare breed, a self-funded lone historian who's dedicated, obsessive, impatient and single-minded, a man whose work defines his life.
South 0171 with a panel of left-facing tassel Bradshaws with a quite an amazing array of dashed lines and lengthy lines positioned around it and seeming to come out from sections of the body. It appears to be painted all as at one time. It's got a smaller figure up to the left with the 2 sort of feathered bars protruding out of the headdress. These don't appear to be a single feather, they're like bars with feathers off the side. The larger figure has got multiple cords suspended from the back of the headdress. Above the head there's all these rows of dashed lines. In the front of the face there's rows of stacked short dashes in a different arrangement to the ones above the head, possibly different meaning.
He was always searching for somebody to question what he'd said about the art. Tell me where it's wrong. Give me another explanation for why this art is beside this one or on top of this one. He was always looking for the answers.
I'm sure Graham believes that until the last square inch of the Kimberleys has been covered and photographed, there is work to be done. He will develop the total corpus, and I don't suppose any other recorder in Australia has done that.
It's around about 1.5 million images, expanding all the time. It's a huge task. Anyone who comes is just absolutely boggled by the amount of information and what he's trying to do. And being an obsessional, fanatic perfectionist, whatever he does has to be done absolutely perfectly.
So this is the dominant figure in the middle, with the elaborate bloody mantilla type headdress at the top and the prongs out the front and the bun out the back and his head round there. Painted here with all these elaborate things up his arms, all these dotted lines come off the armband. And so a little secondary figure here looking at him, and the secondary figure over this side looking at him here, they're facing in, they're different. That's the next step in recording, to go in and record the whole wall, because you come in and you photograph all these pretty things, but you don't have time. It might take you days to get in and analyse the composition of the figures.
The majority of researchers I work with, while not sharing Graham's views, have got no major problem with the fact that he's prepared to answers, okay? And he might be right. He might be right. I don't think he is, but he might be.
I used to see a gallery when I go to Mount Elizabeth the day down there,
where this Nyanduga Ali became Ungut, and he's painted there as a warrant, and he came out of the ground as a serpent. So had this ability to transform across into serpents in a later stage. But Rainbow Serpent, or Ungut over here, is definitely quite separate from Wandjina. It might be Wandjina period, but it's another religious thing. They're interrelated, but they're not the same.
Not laying round again bludgeon, are you?
Yeah, this is the place to be, the heart of the Kimberley, where the temperature is still 2 degrees.
25th of July 1998. This sequence is filmed out of Mount Barnett Station with Billy King, the elders of the Narrabeen people, recording material of his early days and sites of significance around the area. Can you tell us, like, where you were born in this country? And
I was born in Mandia.
Right.
My father died in 1924.
Right.
Well, I call it Wandjina, we used to call it Kaluru.
Gallaroo.
Kaluru, yeah.
What was Gallaroo? Was that just...
That's our tribal, probably Ngarian word, Kaluru, but Wandjina come from Kaluru.
Red ochre, and we call it Danga.
Danga.
That red ochre is Danga.
And that's that blood from that unset. We're just so privileged to be able to see things as beautiful as this on the wall in pristine conditions in their natural setting. Just about the highest high that you can get. It's addictive, that's why I'm here, I guess. There's a big responsibility on the people that are privileged to do this, to use the most sophisticated technology to get the best results, because nobody else will ever see these sites as we saw them. And for generations on, the researchers and scholars, Aboriginal and Caucasian, will be basing their studies on the work that we record.
So why are we remembering Graham Walsh here tonight? It's not only 20 years since the Kimberley Foundation started, it's also 10 years since Graham died. And his influence on the Kimberley Foundation's research agenda is still strong. An integrated, multidisciplined approach to research, such as the Kimberley Foundation has established with its research strategy, was what Graham Walsh dreamt of seeing established. It's an undeniable truth that the Kimberley Foundation as it is today would not exist but for Graham Walsh. And it's also undeniable that he's been heavily criticised and his contribution misunderstood. Let me tell you something of him. This by way of setting the record straight. He was 62 when he died in August 2007, born in central Queensland, out from Roma. An interest in Indigenous culture and rock art in particular grew with him. It grew with him. His mother's great interest in archaeology and other cultures took root in Graham. His proximity to the Carnarvon Range gave him an opportunity to experience rock art at first hand as a child. After a checkered adolescence, he married and set up a garage and Suzuki dealership in Injune. He prospered there, and when only 33, he sold up to devote himself to what he loved, rock art. He took a job with Queensland National Parks and began his annual visit to the Kimberley. In Queensland, he surveyed and recorded all central Queensland sandstone belt rock art and developed a recording methodology that became valuable in the Kimberley. From 1977 until his death, he spent up to 3 months of the year chasing Kimberley rock art, that is, locating and recording rock art sites. He published 2 books on Kimberley rock art. Into a world almost completely oblivious to the Kimberley's extraordinary cultural record arrived his first book in 1994, Bradshaw's Ancient Rock After the Kimberley. Its publication was initiated by an Englishman, a couple of Englishmen and a group of Americans. The Englishman Graham had encountered by chance. Graham had encountered by chance when they were both camped in the far north of the Kimberley at Baxton Creek. And even though it was some Englishmen and some Americans who put it up and it was published in Switzerland, there's a man present tonight who was put the last money in that enabled that book to be published, Paddy Moore. The second was in 2000, Bradshaw Art of the Kimberley, dubbed The Mock Croc. It was published under his impious imprint, Graham's impious imprint, Takaraka, No Wankers. He is famous for his publications and theories on Bradshaw art, but his fascination was with Wandjina art and the beliefs and practices associated with it. He developed a deep respect for Wandjina culture, and when admitted to hospital in 2007 and asked for his religion, he unhesitatingly gave it as Wandjina. And what was he like? Well, first, academically. In just about everything one reads about Graham, the first comment is that he was a man with little formal education. And it's important to repeat it here because it shaped his attitude to the established academic world, and equally importantly, it's to him. And it's definitely ironic, given that he earned a D.Lit from the University of Melbourne and a PhD from Griffith University. And a D.Lit is a rare academic title and is given to those whose original ideas have progressed human understanding in some profound way. So little formal education then, but a lively mind, a lateral thinker with a relentless drive to understand the subjects that interested him, and an obsessive disposition, he called it fanatical, which served him mightily in mastering every angle, every line of inquiry into the target topic. He chased up every lead, no matter how obscure. He was also a born raconteur, and those of you who heard him speak will remember he could draw a compelling narrative from, well, a rock or a handful of facts and events. He had, as his friend Nicholas Rothwell wrote in the perceptive and eloquent obituary published in The Australian, a lone wolf persona. There are adjectives and nouns that come up time and again in relation to Graham, and from my experience, some truth in all of them. Colourful, controversial, charming, engaging, rude, compulsive, paranoid, self-destructive, genius, maverick, manipulative, loyal, generous, obsessive, astonishingly foul-mouthed, vindictive, personable, malicious, controlling, egocentric, irreverent, a man where, and again I take the words from Nicholas Rothwell, energies of light and dark did battle constantly within him. But for the moment, as I come to his legacy and the Kimberley Foundation, I'm going to focus on one particular attribute, his ability to inspire and engage, and to put the results of his concentrated work into compelling theories and possibilities that ignited imagination and called for confirmation or dismissal. It was this skill that saw him invited from 1993 until 2006 to give lectures, run seminars, speak at schools, present for ADFAS in Melbourne, Sydney, Perth or Brisbane. It seemed people couldn't get enough of the world of rock art he was bringing to their attention. In them, he expounded on the details of the different Gwion figures that he called Bradshaws and the results of the fledgling research projects he initiated. He showed the range and styles and content of Kimberley rock art, and he introduced listeners to the sequence in Kimberley rock art. These lectures were filled to capacity. I remember in 1997 when he gave a public lecture at the Sofitel Hotel in Melbourne here. A group of archaeologists sitting in the front row watched in amazement as the auditorium filled, and one of them saying to another, "How do you get this many people along to a lecture on rock art?" And the truth of it is that well-educated people who were well educated and travelled and explored and thought they understood Australia, had never heard anything about this art and the possibilities for giving otherwise inaccessible insights into Australia's past. He told it, and he told it compellingly. Graham's legacy, then, is firstly the passion for Kimberley rock art that motivates those who were introduced to it by him. Many on the Kimberley Foundation board were first inspired by him. Many of those with a role in the history of the Kimberley Foundation were inspired by him. To him goes the credit for the enduring inspiration to pursue the truth and to do so with the people on whose country this art is found. The second major plank to his legacy is the sequence in the Kimberley rock art from oldest to the most recent that he discerned. Careful examination of the superimpositions in the rock art led him to conclusions about the order in which they had been painted. The sequence was established by superimpositions, where one style of art is painted over the top of another. The sequence he established remains the starting point for rock art studies in the Kimberley today. And the third part of his legacy, and it's of inestimable value, is his database. You saw him collecting it, you saw how much detail went into it. It's an enormous collection of images, detailed recordings, and accompanying field notes, which has contributed in a fundamental way to the large-scale research projects underway now. For example, it's been used to identify target sites for two of our current research projects, the Rock Art Dating Project and the Kimberley Visions Project. Now, Damien from Melbourne University is here sampling from a rock art. On the left, you can see it. On the right is this figure, which is here, which Graham recorded. And this is the page of his recording and the details of it. And it was from these notes that Damien was able to identify that this was a site he wanted to sample from. I mentioned also in our achievements that the plant depictions in Kimberley rock art have been recognised as being the most numerous and detailed and the earliest in the world. That conclusion and that study was done entirely from Graham's database. The photos that were examined that formed the basis of that piece of research all came from the database. An important part also of the database is the method by which art sites are recorded. Graham's detailed recording system has been refined since his death to utilise new technology and forms the foundation of today's recording process for many research projects. So the legacy, in short, inspired many, gave us the sequence, gave us the database. So now I come to the real setting the record straight, the criticisms and misconceptions. Graham has attracted trenchant criticism, and having just read a lot of it to write this talk, is to call it trenchant is to understate it. There are three main planks to the criticisms. The first is the most damaging. It is often said that he had no traditional informants nor Aboriginal people working with him, and it is simply not true. From his first year in the Kimberley, 77, he sat with the old people at Mount Elizabeth, Gibb River, Maunjum and Columbaroo, and he was still working with them in 2005 when he and Omberan went out together on the Charnley River. Perhaps this allegation is best refuted in his own words taken from his notes. There are numerous encounters to draw from, and I've selected a few. Jagamara was first encountered at Mount Elizabeth, and Graham last saw him slipping out of Columbaroo with his bundle of spears and his numerous dogs to die as he had lived in solitary independence. This then is how Graham describes him: a unique individual, intelligent and quick-moving, and totally self-sufficient, clinging defiantly to the old ways and shunning European ways, maintaining a solitary existence, hunting and moving through the Kimberley bush, visiting Wandjina sites and keeping alive his belief system. From him, Graham learnt the traditional ways of bush living and records, Jagamara engendered in me a lasting respect for the culture that was and a determination to preserve to the best of my ability an accurate a record to serve as a link with the past for the culture which was evolving. He spent much time with Sam Woolagudja over many years, and his debt to him is clear. Sam Woolagudja was a Warora man, then living in Old Maungim. Graham's words, another remarkable individual retaining a vast amount of traditional knowledge, including the mythology and technology associated with Wandjina rock art. He speaks of his cheerful disposition, of his visits with Sam to Wandjina galleries where Graham recorded the processes of repainting, including the practice of leaving food offerings for the paintings. He speaks of numerous conversations with Sam recording the mythology of Namarale, the one on the left, Woolagudja's personal Wandjina, but also a dominant deity of the West Coast saltwater sites. There was Mimi Tadiran, known as Rolly. Then residing at Gibb River, he was the traditional custodian for Wannaleary, the site central to the main Wandjina mythology. He took Graham to Wannaleary and other sites. He would make Graham repeat back to him the stories related to the site to make sure Graham had got it right. There are accounts of many meetings, and they're all fascinating. The trips he took with Dicky Udmara and later his brother Hector Tungle make for compelling reading. Udmara was one of the last of the old men to come in from the bush, and there's a great story of his taking Graham to Ledger Moreau, a hugely significant site in the Wandjina belief system. It is the sacred location where Wollonganda, a supreme deity, pushed up the sky, creating the Milky Way. Many knew of the site, but no one knew where it was. In fact, Graham had begun to think that it didn't actually have a physical location. It was so sacred, it was just in the heavens. Until one memorable day, Udmara took him there and related to him all the associated mythology. And that picture on the right is the day Udmara took Graham there, and he sat on the front of the quad and told Graham where to go, and he just pointed a straight line. There was rocks, huge rocks and boulders, and Graham said it was just the most extraordinary trip he'd ever done. And in his own words, recording the associated mythology of this most important mythological gallery represents the most memorable event of my work with Kimberley Aborigines. So that's the first criticism was usually levelled at him. And the second is that it was averred that he said a mystery race of non-Aboriginal people, probably Asiatic, had painted the Guion or Bradshaw figures. He never actually said this. What he pointed to were the very great differences between contemporary Wandjina paintings and the older paintings. He hypothesised that there had been multiple waves of migration to Australia, possibly over tens of thousands of years, and he pointed to the presence of the large boats painted in the Bradshaw style as possible evidence of this. Here are two examples of the very large boats, one containing 23 and one containing 27 people. They look like they represent planned voyages. There's a lot of people on board, there are women on board, and one of them has got what looks like a rudimentary steering system. They come, in the terms of the style of the art, they come after the classic Bradshaws and before the classic Wandjina figures. They're in the middle of the Kimberley art sequence, and that led him to hypothesise that these large-scale movements of people occurred after an initial colonisation. He was very clear that all his possible explanations needed research to prove or disprove them, and this he repeats in his books. Further, he was always eager to hear alternative possible explanations. Graham was driven to uncover the true cause of the huge stylistic differences in the art. And the third major criticism that's levelled at him, it was said he described Aboriginal people as crude and unsophisticated and incapable of painting the finely drawn Guion Bradshaw figures. He did compare the brushstrokes and the techniques used in the different styles, but it was never Graham who said the people were crude and unsophisticated. In fact, anyone who ever heard Graham speak about the old men who were his informants would know that the depth of his admiration for their complex religious beliefs, their rituals, and the discipline of their society. So I just want to touch on his unfinished work, much of which will be picked up by the Kimberley, some of which will be picked up by the Kimberley Foundation as the years go on, some of which already is. So 10 years on, and the unfinished projects of Graham literally litter the archive. I'll just mention a few of them. One is a project that would see the completion of the Kimberley-wide mapping and recording of art sites. There is much of the Kimberley still to be surveyed for art. Every year, more great galleries are found, mostly by chance. The systematic exploration and recording that he starts waits to be completed. It is necessary for future planning for the Kimberley. It's necessary for the tourism industry, which is growing, and for detailed rock art studies. It's necessary for industry, which is lurking on the edge of the Kimberley all the time. It is necessary for the protection of the art. I am conscious that many have said that the difficulty in protecting Pilbara art was that development came before the full cultural surveys had been done. Now, another unfinished and very desirable project relates to the Frobenius Institute of 1938. Many of you know of this expedition, and I'd be pretty sure many of you have never heard of it. In 1938, a Frankfurt-based institute organised an expedition to northwest Australia under the leadership of Helmut Petrie. As I speak, photos of the sites that expedition was taken to by Aboriginal people is going to appear. They'll just scroll through. Petrie and his companion, Douglas Fox, travelled with Aboriginal guides from Munja to Drysdale River Mission, then at Pargo, now at Columbaroo, recording art sites and the associated stories. Their maps were woefully inadequate. Like many are today, Graham Walsh was fascinated by the Frobenius expedition. Relocating the sites that Petrie and Fox visited became something of an obsession. To quote Graham, individual files were created on each site where any scrap of information that he came across was systematically added. This permitted a steadily expanding understanding of each site, its art and its pertinent mythology, making it possible to ask increasingly rewarding questions from informants, as well as focus search areas as opportunities arose. The first 15 years, says Graham, were the most frustrating, but the progressively fine-tuned site search files combined with developing technology began to produce results. He found them all. A publication on the Frobenius sites and their significance, complemented by the stories of their rediscovery, is an uncompleted project that was dear to Graham and remains dear to me. After his death, Graham's extensive archive was given to me. The last project, this is the last project we're dealing with, it was one not begun by Graham, that is ongoing and coming from his archive. After his death, Graham's extensive archive was given to me by his family under certain conditions. And one of the tasks that his family and I are in agreement about, and that the KFA is supporting and enabling, is that information contained within the archive be shared with the relevant communities. To this end, conversations have taken place with a number of groups. The undigitised remainder of the material related to the Balangara people and their country is currently being prepared with funding from Kimberley Foundation to be shared with them. Specific material related to Sam Woolagudja and his work with Graham has already been collated and shared with his family at their request. The legacy Graham left in his archive will continue to serve the protection of the cultural assets in many ways. I'm afraid this is a superficial snapshot of a driven and gifted human being who has left a remarkable legacy for Australians. But there is, high up on an east-facing plateau, looking out over Theda, a memorial to Graham Walsh. Words said of him by many are inscribed there. And one reads, Graham Walsh, without whom Kimberley rock art would not be known or understood. It's a very big claim, but would all this work be happening but for him? So the future of the Kimberley Foundation from here, what are we looking at? Looking to the next 20 years, our drivers remain constant. Research, preserve and promote. Our values too remain constant. We would see the organisation embedded even more firmly in the Indigenous world of the Kimberley. Research will remain integrated and multidisciplined, focused on all facets of early habitation in the Kimberley to yield eventually Australia's story. And preservation, knowledge of the threats to the preservation of Kimberley rock art is emerging from the research. Already one chemical reason for the complete disappearance of the art in some panels has been identified. Identify the cause and points the way to the means of protection. With promotion, a suite of new technologies, as well as the more traditional, like this lecture, is being employed to promote the cultural legacy of the Kimberley and the advances in knowledge resulting from the research. A generous gift for the purposes of a film on the research work in the Kimberley has introduced another facet to our work of promotion. Requests to use the knowledge resulting from the research in school and Indigenous ranger programs are becoming more frequent, and the Kimberley Foundation is preparing to enter an agreement at the moment with Woodside and the Kimberley Land Council to deliver such programs. The establishment of the two chairs brings ongoing responsibilities for the Kimberley Foundation. Strong and cooperative relationships are needed to ensure agreement about research objectives, promotion of findings and Indigenous engagement. Andy Gledo, Peter Veth, who holds the Kimberley Foundation Ian Potter Chair at the University of Western Australia, Susan Bradley and Sam Lovell have been captured on film speaking of the future work of the Kimberley Foundation. I can do no better than to leave you with their words and ideas.
I see over the next 3 to 5 years, as a lot of our projects come to maturity, that we will start to see this large picture, the grand picture emerging in ever greater detail. One of the other things that's happening is that we're starting to look at what is happening outside the Kimberley, because the Kimberley was not a world unto itself. It was the people of the Kimberley and the environments of the Kimberley were interacting with people and environments in neighbouring areas, whether they be in across the water in Southeast Asia or whether they be in neighbouring regions of Australia. One of the objectives of the Kimberley Visions project, the archaeological project, is to actually compare the development of the rock art sequence in the eastern part of the Kimberley with the also well-established rock art sequence in Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory.
Looking at very complex rock art bodies in the northeast Kimberley, areas that we think will go back at least 50,000 years, but addressing an overriding research question which has been hanging and poised for over 30 years in Northern Australia. Where do the different styles develop from? Why are some of the earlier styles between Western Arnhem Land, Victoria River District and East Kimberley and the Kimberley the same? Why do they change after a certain point of time? And so we're actually trying to understand these really deep time, human, symbolic landscape relationships where we know the sea level has risen 130 metres and drowned half the Kimberley landscape.
And it's so exciting to think what these scientists are discovering and uncovering, and what's even more wonderful is that the young Aboriginal people who are involved in the field research and who are out there with these scientists are learning and wanting to know so much more about their ancestors.
What I really like to see, these young people become a custodian of each site. We know some of the art, they will deteriorate and all this, and we are trying to find a way of trying to protect that. And make sure it survive all that. But the main thing is to get all that thing carbon dated and photographed and the story told, and put it into an archive somewhere where for future generations. That's the most important.
Thank you.